Hi, it's Mark, your Madison Court Torque. Monday, I went over observations on gender and wine. Today, I will go over a brief, not even remotely comprehensive history of wine in America. So, the history of wine in America is inseparable from America's attitudes towards alcohol itself. It is also inseparable from the early failures of grape growing. Most grapes that are native to America were not exactly good for drinking. Furthermore, growing Old World grapes was nearly impossible at the time, or it was deemed impossible to make. One of America's greatest intellectuals, Thomas Jefferson, found it impossible to make Old World grapes grow from the Bordeaux region, which is one of his go-to styles. Once it was deemed that wine was not exactly a great venture to get into, America went all in on whiskey. Back in the good old days, whiskey was much safer to drink than water. Coincidentally, it was much easier to abuse. Now, this is a very important point for later. The California gold rush of the 1840s and 50s brought many Americans to the West Coast in search of wealth. Many Italian Americans took vines with them. Over time, the most planted and most popular grapes in America were of Italian origin. The Industrial Revolution in America really didn't start to take off in earnest until the late 19th, early 20th century. Men were doing manual labor outside of the home, and it was metaphorically and sometimes literally backbreaking. To ease the pain they were facing, men decided to use hard liquor to medicate themselves. As mentioned, liquor is very easy to abuse, and this also led to, unfortunately, spousal abuse. A lot of men were spending way too much of their wages on alcohol, and these two factors led to both the temperance and prohibition movements. Prohibition was passed in January of 1919, and it was illegal to make alcohol with the exception of a few things like home winemaking, medicinal purposes, and, of course, religious purposes. With laws, however, come racial and ethnic profiling, and many immigrants who weren't favored at the time, Southeastern Europeans, were most likely the ones who would get the severe punishments for breaking alcohol laws. Prohibition proved only as strong as the law enforcement was willing to make it. There were indeed plenty of dirty cops and mayors willing to take a bribe. Plus, the mob was created and empowered during this time. Way to go, Prohibition. Real success story. Prohibition was repealed under the 21st Amendment in December of 1933, with the first beer to be delivered to President Roosevelt. Allegedly. Also, allegedly, it was a Budweiser. What an insult. But the grapes weren't ready to hit the ground running. Many winemakers switched to different crops to make ends meet during Prohibition. Not only was the wine industry having troubles taking off, but there was another event that slowed the production of winemaking down: World War II. During this time period, farmland was used for war-related efforts. Americans, over in France, acquired a taste for French wine. This meant that Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Pinot Noir would be the grapes of choice for American consumer, as opposed to Italian wines that were originally planted. Today, those four grapes are in America's top 5 most planted grapes, with Zinfandel coming in at number 4. American wine renaissance began in the 1960s when Robert Mondavi created labels that prominently featured varietals as opposed to regions. This made it easier for the American consumer to determine their varietal of choice. English wine aficionado heard of great things coming out of America in spite of wine being incredibly cheap. Steve Spurrier, after tasting a few bottles, deemed that they were worthy to do a blind taste testing. He set up the 1976 Judgment of Paris, in which American wines won first place in both the red and white categories, as opposed to the French wines. The outstanding and controversial part of this whole thing was that all the judges were French. From that point on, Napa Valley was associated with fine wine, and it became a tourist destination. In August of 1978, Robert Parker's magazine, The Wine Advocate, first came out. Prior to this time, wine articles were created by the wine companies themselves. Now there was someone who could objectively tell you whether a wine was good or not based on a point system. Other magazines would come out later. In 1984, Fred Dame went over to England to take the necessary test to become Master Sommelier, who would be the third American in history, but also the first American to pass all tests in a row. Fred and a few fellow sommeliers decided to create their own American equivalent Master's Court. They set up their own tests and eventually fine-tuned it to what has become today. However, the American wine experiment has not been without its very own issues post-Prohibition. First off, we're still in the process of figuring out what grapes can grow where and be successful. We would still be having this issue if Prohibition did not happen, but we would be much further along in the process. Secondly, America still has a weird attitude towards alcohol. Drinking alcohol illegally during Prohibition was thrilling to many people. After it became legal for adults, this thrill did not go away for teenagers, whose idea of rebellion includes drinking and not getting caught by mom and dad. European children, however, don't rebel in this way because it would be pointless. Thirdly, there is Napa exceptionalism. Many people view Napa Valley Cabernet as the best thing that America has to offer and will settle for nothing less. This very narrow view has hindered American consumers' desire to try new things. Also, there can be, or there actually is, an intangible smugness that it can be felt in Napa Valley. Fourthly, many experts in wine don't know the difference between showing off and being educational. Wine is not meant to be intimidating. Unfortunately, it can become that way given how many options there are and what little consumers know. Here is where the authority figure comes in. How helpful he is depends on whether he is treating you as a student or as a complete idiot. Lastly, we don't treat wine like the Europeans do. Namely, most Americans buy wine and consume it within 8 hours of purchase, and we do not pair it with food. Europeans do the exact opposite in that they pair it with food and they wait a little while. So there you go. Join me Monday when I go over an awesome, exciting wine purchase that I'm totally looking forward to. Thanks for watching and bearing with all the stutters that I've been doing throughout this video, and have a fantastic rest of your day.